So, good morning, just about. Good morning. Welcome to another Crisp Malt webinar. I have to apologise, I'm a bit of a newbie at this, so if I make a complete horlicks of it, it's all down to me. But I am Steve Poidevin. I am the Sales Director at Crisp. Been joined here by Mike Benson.
Hi everyone, I'm Mike and I'm the Sales Manager for the West of England and Wales.
Very good, thank you Mike. And today we are going to talk a little bit about the 2020 crop. So the growing season, what the quality was like, and therefore then some brewing implications and what you might need to look out for when you start brewing your new season's malt. So being the amateur, it's my task to try and share my screen with you and see how we get on.
You can do it, we've got confidence.
Are you sure?
Just trying to help.
Okay. That's very kind of you, Mike. So my screen should have appeared.
Yep, so I can see it.
Thank you very much. Great stuff. So here we go. So if I can get it to move. Thank you very much. There we go. Right. So as I've said, growing season review, look at the quality to date, and then think about the brewing implications. And that's what I'll hand over to Mike, who's far more technically minded than I am.
Yep, you can do the weather report.
I'll do the weather report. Yes, indeed. So first up, a little bit about the growing cycle and which bits of the season are important to us and more important than others. So if we just look at the winter barley growing cycle, then starting in September, planting time for winter barley is September, ideally into early October. Also important in the autumn, in the winter crops, is the planting of wheat, winter wheat being our biggest cereal in the UK. So that is important to us and of more of a commercial implication. And then spring barley, if we were interested in spring barley as the distillers are, and other customers, we would be planting that in ideally middle of March in England, a bit later in Scotland. And then the growing season continues through into June, July, and then late July, early August would be harvest for winter barley, and spring barley coming in a little bit later than that, in Scotland a little bit later still. So the key areas are planting time in September, October, planting time again for the spring crop in March, April, and then really this growing season through the spring and summer. So how did we get on this year? Cast your mind back to life before COVID. I'll just have a think about that. That's lovely. And so autumn 2019, we had early start to the planting season in August, and then what happened was it started raining. So just by way of explanation, these charts are from the Met Office. They are showing the rainfall, and it's the variance of the rainfall to the 30-year average, 1981 to 2010 average. So anything that's bluer is wetter than average. Anything brown and browner it gets is drier than average. So you can see autumn, meteorological autumn is September, October and November. It was pretty wet, especially Lincolnshire and into Yorkshire, but even East Anglia and the south was still wet, and these are the areas where cereals are typically grown. So the impact of this was a big drop in the planted area of wheat in particular, because wheat gets planted a little bit later, but also some of the winter barley plantings were down. So people couldn't get on the land because it was too wet. So that means that we've got a lower planting of winter barley and a lower planted area of winter wheat. So the impact of that is obviously we're going to get a smaller crop, but also that does leave a lot more land for spring barley planting, potentially, if the weather comes right in the spring. So a wet autumn through a reasonably wet winter, and then you come into spring. And early spring, February, late winter, early spring, and It was wet. It was horrendous. If you can remember back into all the floods we had, I've never seen anything quite so blue as this. And we've got through more toner cartridge printing these out than we have done in my course of my career. So this was really heavy rain. So obviously there was going to be delays. Planting of spring barley would start middle of February normally. And obviously it didn't because everything was underwater. So when it did stop raining later on, that meant that planting could eventually commence. But by the time it commenced, we were beyond the ideal date. So any spring barley that was going to go into the ground was potentially planted too late to get full yield potential out of the crop. It's worth noting in here, one of the exceptions to the rule was the northeast of Scotland. And the northeast of Scotland is very important because it grows the majority of the Scottish distilling barley crop is grown in the northeast of Scotland, up in this part and across along the Moray Firth coast and into the Black Isle. And you can see this bit up here was much more normal in terms of the weather, the rainfall in February. And actually over winter, it was average as well. So it's good news up here because the planting could go on at the normal time in the north of Scotland. Everywhere else was going to be delayed. You've also got to bear in mind that the poor old winter crop was sat in the ground. The winter crop that was in the ground was sat underwater, so it was getting pretty bogged down and not progressing like it should have been in the early spring. So moving on, the old adage, be careful what you wish for. Everyone wished it would stop raining, and by God did it stop raining. So the only good thing about it stopping raining was it made it a bit more bearable. The first lockdown, which started on the 23rd of March, it was warm, sunny, dry, and we could all sit out in the garden and have a beer and commiserate from the fact that we weren't allowed out of our back gardens. But the dry weather, this was the spring average, and bear in mind it didn't stop raining until towards the end of March, and meteorological spring is March, April, and May. You know, it was pretty dry. And if we actually look at May itself, May was horrendously dry. So the crop did get planted, the spring crop. The winter crop could start growing, but then pretty quickly everything ran out of water. So the crop was then growing under stress. The winter crop going into wet soils with a wet winter didn't have the need to put down a big root structure. So it was going to struggle a bit in the dry because it didn't have the root structure in place. Water had been on hand. Suddenly it wasn't, and the roots weren't there to go looking for water. So the winter crop struggled a bit. The spring crops definitely struggled. Everything was under stress. Again, point to note, the northeast of Scotland was more average. Scotland itself was not as dry as average through May, and it was a more average growing season up here. So that is the good news that continues to go on. And then we move into summer. We had a little bit of rain come along. Summer was wetter than average. So unfortunately, probably did more harm than good, because so the impact of this dry weather meant that the crop was growing under stress. The crop develops, the initial seed germinates, and then it tillers and it grows 3 or 4 new stems. So the one stem becomes 4 or 5 potentially. And because it was growing under stress, especially the spring crop, it didn't tiller quite as much. So you didn't get the number of plants. That means yield potential is down. But it also means that if the farmer had put the amount of fertilizer that he normally puts on, you had a yield dilution effect because he had put on the amount for 5 plants and he's only got 3. So he's actually putting on more fertilizer potentially than he wanted to. The other point about the rain is that the fertilizer was put on the ground. The ground was probably too dry to mobilize all of those nutrients. So when it does rain, it started to mobilize that fertilizer that was left. And when we look at where we are in the growing season, the ears are developing, it's starting to ripen. The nitrogen is likely to go up into the ear. So you've got a yield dilution effect, and you potentially got a late rush of nitrogen fertilizer. And that's going to help push the nitrogen content up in the ear. It's something that farmers do on wheat to get the proteins up. We don't want it in malting barley. The other point in the spring barley, sorry, in the run up to harvest, was the fact that summer was not all that sunny either, and we did have some big storms, and that wrecked some of the crop. So that has put our supply and demand balance out of kilter a little bit. East Anglia was okay, where a lot of the English spring barley comes from, around the eastern side and Lincolnshire. Yorkshire didn't fare quite so well. Scotland managed to get their crop in. So that's the story of the season. Probably if you look at the stats in a few years' time, it will say that on average, we were average temperature, average sunshine, average rain. But actually, it was very much a growing season of two halves, to fall into an old cliche. So that's where the weather took us. So what did that do for the quality? So this is quality to date. So what I've got in here is some AHDB data. AHDB is the Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board. They do surveys every year of all the crops. So they take samples of all the crops. So this survey is comparing like with like, really. So the samples they've taken of barley, the barley crop, it's all barley, it's feed barley, malting barley, spring barley, winter barley. So it becomes a little more difficult to separate out the information, but you can compare like with like. So you can just see across the seasons what we've got. And just looking at this data, comparing seasons. So specific weight, its old term is bushel weight. It's basically, you know, how it's a volumetric thing. How much does a set volume of grain weigh? It's slightly heavier than last year, which is good. One of the problems we had last year was it was a thinner, slightly thinner crop. So slightly heavier crop. The nitrogen content is slightly higher. That's not so good for us, although the standard deviation has come up a bit. So that's the spread of nitrogens across the range. So we're seeing a bigger spread of nitrogen. So we have got some low and we've got some high. But generally, screenings are low. So we've got lower screenings and we've got a bigger corn size. So the retained on a 2.5 is the big corns. And so that's good news that is up. So that's an overall view. If we then look at winters versus springs, this is where it's starting to see some differences coming up. You can see the winters are a heavier crop. So we've got the bigger crop in here in terms of weight, which is probably the impact of the winter barley, plus the impact of some of the spoiling of the later crops through the weather, the less than ideal weather through August. And then we've got a much higher nitrogen content in the winters than we have in the springs. But we've still got good grain size, slightly bigger in the springs. So we can see there's definitely a difference in there. And obviously a high nitrogen for the winters is not ideal. And then if we look at Scotland and England, we saw the more ideal growing season in Scotland. Then you can see in here that we've got a much lower nitrogen in Scotland than we have in England. But similar grain size, still good screenings. Bushel weight is higher in England. It's probably the impact of some of the lost barley in the borders. But generally, the northeast of Scotland, low nitrogen, good grain size, very good quality. So that's the overall view of the harvest. So where have crisp come out of it? So our intake to date, we've got Maris Otter. We've secured just about enough Maris Otter to look after our customers. The nitrogens are going to be up slightly on last year, but the grain size is bigger. So we think we're going to be in around the sort of low to mid 1.6s on the nitrogen content, but with a good grain size, better grain size than last year. So the brewing implications shouldn't be huge. Hopefully we're going to be able to get more extract due to the grain size, which is going to offset the slightly higher nitrogen. With the best ales, we're struggling with the volume of the low nitrogen winters we need. So what we've managed to do is move some other barleys, lower nitrogen, from other parts of the country to supplement our low nitrogen winter barley in East Anglia. So we have managed to secure enough low nitrogen barley to keep all our customers happy, hopefully, in the craft sector, going forward through this what's going to be a difficult season. And obviously the distillers in Scotland, any craft distillers out there, it's good news, because we've got plenty of low nitrogen barley around for the distilling crop. So bearing in mind that we're going to be up slightly on our nitrogens across the board, and we've seen the whole crop is up across the board, I think it's probably a good time for me to hand over to Mike, who can hopefully give you a technical update on what to do with it all.
Yeah, Steve.
So what we didn't manage to do, though, in a true style of the double act, is decide what we're going to do. Am I going to drive your slides, Mike? Would you like me to drive them from here, or would you like to take control?
I think you should stay in control, Steve. If your attention span can manage and you can keep up, then I'm happy for you to do it.
Well, I can't guarantee that, but I shall try.
I'm sure I've got confidence in you.
Yes, just whistle if I'm looking out the window.
You'll be off getting your beer, I dare say. Okay.
Get to that time. Right.
It's not morning anymore.
On you go.
Yes, mate, thank you. So when we first put these slides together, we were really worried about some quite high nitrogen figures coming through, and especially off just some of the English side, where you see nitrogen levels around 175. We talk about why we don't want high nitrogen levels in the malt, and a lot of that just comes back to people think, oh, it's just haze, but we just wanted to go into a bit more detail around what actually happens if you do get some high nitrogens, and some things that you need to look out for. So do you want to move on, Steve? Super, thank you. So Steve mentioned the corn size. It's really important to get some nice, big, bold corn sizes. If you remember, we've moved up from, we've gone up kind of like a size from 2020, from 2019, and then even 2018, going back a bit further. They were quite horrible small corn sizes and brought quite a few issues. But the corn size is basically just down to the weather and the variety of the barley. Now, we screen them off as we pass them through a 2.25 mil screen and a 2.5 mil screen. And basically, the lower stuff that we can't do anything with disappears for feed and a few other bits and bobs. And then we use the rest of it. So we want really high screenings to show that we've got nice big bold corns. Basically, the bigger the corn size, the more extract you're going to get from it. But more importantly, if you've got uneven corn sizes, then we can get some variations as we're starting to malt it. So we can get different water uptake as we're steeping it. So the first part of the process in malting, when we hydrate it, if you've got smaller corn size in the same pot as a bigger one, then we can start to see some different levels of water uptake. Obviously, the smaller one's going to take it up quicker than the bigger one, and then we're going to get different germination and different modification levels as we move through, and that's not good at all. It's going to get uneven germination, and it's going to cause us all sorts of milling problems, where we could get some hard ends left over and not actually be able to get at all the extracts, and also brewhouse issues, clarity issues, and wort filtration issues. So really important that we've got good corn size, and this year we have. It's great.
If I may just point something else out, the standard deviation is lower this year as well, which means that we've got a higher majority of all of that big bold corns as at the top end. So there's less variation in the corn size this year, which is good news.
Good point. Thank you. That's why we leave him on.
They are.
Okay, do you want to move forward? Nice one. So we talk about nitrogen in barley. The main reason for that is we use it as a measure of protein. Pretty much all the nitrogen that is in barley is protein. So we can see off the crop year that this year we we were really, really worried that it was going to be very, very high. And then when all of the data got brought in, it actually looks quite similar to the average of 2019. And that table's got all of the barley in there, whether that's feed or malted barley, it's the whole intake. But if we split it over, we can see that actually England's a lot higher than what Scotland is. So there's still a little bit of things to worry about. If you do get high nitrogen malt, then we can get these steely grains. So the little bit grayer, and it's still harder for the moisture to get into the grain. And again, it's a little bit more difficult to steep and hydrate the grain. Also, if you've got high levels of nitrogen, the grain's only big enough for a certain amount of starch, the sugar that we use, and a certain amount of nitrogen. So if we've got high levels of nitrogen, then we've got lower levels of starch, basically. And a mixture of them both is going to give us some potential processing issues. So we kind of want to make sure we keep an eye on boil pH, make sure we've got the boil optimized, we've got a nice pH drop into the region that we're after. We optimize our kettle finings to make sure that they're optimized and we're not dropping out too much protein and not leaving enough behind. And also further down the line with auxiliary and isinglass finings, we optimize those just to make sure you're not going to get any issues. There's lots of people that can help out with this. The team at Crisp can help you out, but also the guys at Murphy's and Vickers can give you a hand as well. They sell kits, so you can check them yourself, or if you give them a ring, I'm sure they'll be able to come in and still help you out, even in the times that we're in, looking out the window. Looking okay, Steve? Thank you. So what we've got is a little Kettle Optima optimization video from Murphy's. So if you do go off and buy their kit and choose to do it yourself, you can see this video. It's available on YouTube, but we'll play it now as well.
Hopefully it's going to work.
Yeah, it will. I've got confidence.
Have you?
Can you turn your sound up? It's because it's going through your ears.
Ah.
Yeah, so you'll have to unplug your headset for it to play the sound. I know you can hear it, we can't.
Right. Technical interlude.
Technical issue again, so we'll come back and try and sort that out later on, I think.
Should we move on?
Yep. Colin will be able to work his magic on that.
Oops.
Okie dokie. Right, extract, yep. So, as I said before, the increased nitrogen level will give reduced extract. That is just basically there's not enough room in the grain for both starch and sugar. Starch and nitrogen. If you've got high levels of nitrogen, you've got low levels of starch. So when you come to use it, just make sure you check your malt certificate, and do check the as is section and not the dry. The as is basically that's taking into consideration the moisture that's already within the grain, whereas the dry, it has that moisture out. So if you use the dry weight for any of your calculations, you're going to get a different result. So it's always the as is. And we can see from between 2020 and 2019, again, the specific weight of the averages is pretty similar. We know that at Chris, we're going to give out nitrogens of around about 1.6, 1.65. So we're expecting the extract to be pretty similar as well to what 2019 crop was. Okay, Steve? So diastatic power, this is basically the enzymes within the grain. So this is the alpha amylase and beta amylase that we use to break down the starch in the mash tun. So that the higher the level of diastatic power, the more enzyme activity we've got, and the quicker it's going to break it down within the mash tun. Higher levels of nitrogen can bring high levels of diastatic power. So if you do start using you start using high nitrogen malt, it's something to be aware of, because it might cause inconsistencies throughout fermentation. Suddenly you could start over attenuating, excuse me, compared to the crop before. So if you are using some slightly higher malt, and you do start to see some higher nitrogen malt, you do start to see this over attenuation or under attenuation maybe. There's a few things that we can do within the mash tun, or the mash conversion vessel, to be able to control that. So a thin, low temperature mash, so 63 degrees C, is going to encourage more simple sugars to be formed, and that's going to give you more fermentable worts. On the other hand, a thicker, high temperature mash, up to about 68, is going to encourage more complex sugars, and that's going to be less fermentable. And if you are doing any checks, or every time you brew really, just before you start to sparge and run off, it's always a good idea to check the iodine. Check for starch residue using iodine, and do that within the grain as well. So really push in there to make sure you've got everything out. Okay. So FAN, so free amino nitrogen. We need FAN for yeast growth, and the free amino nitrogen level is, if you've got more nitrogen within the grain, chances are you're going to get a higher free amino nitrogen level as well. Now, if we've got more free amino nitrogen, then it can affect the fermentation level. So you can get raging, out of control fermentations, again, over attenuation. You could get a lot of yeast head being generated and lose beer as you're over foaming, have to start using anti-foam if you're not. And you can also get excessive yeast growth, which is going to reduce your alcohol production, because the yeast isn't concentrating on converting starch, convert sugar into alcohol. It's concentrating on reproducing, in which case it's not going to produce alcohol. And yeah, high nitrogen malt is going to give you high levels of FAN. So to control that, it's really, really important to manage your pitch rate. So using your microscope or however you do it, make sure you're managing your pitch rate, and also your wort oxygen levels. You may need to just adjust them if you do start seeing those issues. Another thing about FAN, if you've got increased FAN and increased soluble nitrogen, is colour uptake during the boil. So you may see the colour on the malt specification sheet be exactly the same, but that isn't boiled wort colour. That's just off the kiln. As we then take it through the brew house, process it, put more heat into it and boil it for an hour, we're also encouraging a lot more reactions within the boil. And if we've got more free amino nitrogen, then we're going to get more Maillard reactions, and we could get quite a big colour increase as well. So again, another thing with high nitrogen malt is really keep an eye on your colours, not just what's on the C of A that's being produced, but actually what's coming through. And if you do start to see a bit of a spike, it might all be just back down to the nitrogen levels. Okay, Steve?
Great. Well, you're done.
Is that it? Yes.
Is that it?
Is that it?
Certainly appears like that.
Yeah, there we go.
You did a good job putting the presentation together, because you only put your name on the back. So if anybody's got any questions, they can only go to you.
Well, that's why I put my name on the back, because it's probably the best person to go to. If they went to you, just pass it on anyway.
I'm not going to argue with that at all.
But if you work.
I hope that everyone has found that very useful. If you do have any questions, then obviously please do come back to Mike, or come back to me, or come back to any of the team, depending on which part of the country you happen to be in. But we're all happy to help, and hopefully we'll be able to answer any questions that you may have. You got anything further to add, Mike?
No, just thank you for continued support during 2020, and we're looking forward to working everyone in 2021.
Indeed. I echo that. Thank you very much.